The file begins with a simple typewritten phrase, half faded from decades of poor storage. Object 712, listening station, High Arctic. Nothing more, no coordinates, no maps. Just a code name that points toward the invisible north, to a place even Soviet pilots whispered about, but never named aloud. The Arctic Circle was filled with installations like this, scattered outposts of steel and concrete built in permafrost, humming against the silence of the tundra. But this one, according to rumor, was different. It did not merely monitor radio frequencies of NATO submarines or transpolar flights. Its task was broader, stranger, to listen for signals that no one ever admitted existed. Construction began in the late 1950s, when Khrushchev's government pushed resources into polar militarization. Entire brigades of Gulag laborers were brought north under the escort of NKVD guards, vanishing into white wastelands where no outsider could track them. Prisoners hammered foundations into frozen soil, laid rail spurs that ended in nothingness, and erected skeletal antenna arrays that disappeared into snowstorms. The official paperwork said meteorological facility. The workers called it the dead ear of the tundra. Some were told they were building a listening post for NATO bombers crossing the pole. Others whispered that the ground itself vibrated with strange pulses, that the arrays were designed not to receive, but to contain. When the settlement around Object 712 appeared on maps, it was never given a proper name, only a code, P-17. A secret city, absent from atlases, but supplied with convoys of canned food, diesel fuel, and crates marked electronic equipment, priority. Pilots who ferried in cargo spoke of strange instructions, never speak to the garrison, never look directly at the antennas. Once, a pilot reported a faint, high-pitched whine through his headset as he approached, though his radio was switched off. The sound ceased the moment his plane touched the airstrip. The flight log describing the event was marked false entry and locked away. By the early 1960s, local Nenets reindeer herders began to circulate their own folklore. They spoke of glowing lights above the horizon at night, unnatural green arcs that pulsed like a heartbeat. Dogs refused to approach the perimeter fence. Hunters claimed their compasses spun wildly, and some reindeer collapsed without explanation, foam at their mouths. Yet official documents make no mention of these events. Instead, the archived reports describe increased productivity and successful monitoring of hostile communications. The silence about the strange phenomena is louder than any admission. Still, fragments survived. A declassified KGB memorandum dated March 1962 refers to unapproved transmissions detected by Station P-17. It notes that the frequency did not match NATO, civilian aviation, or any known Soviet equipment. The phrase anomalous spectral profile is underlined twice. The attached addendum is missing. Only a blank page remains, ripped from the file. Then, without warning, the transmission stopped. On a January night in 1963, every array at Objects 7 and 12 went silent. Supply aircraft were turned away mid-flight. Convoys en route were ordered back. And for 3 months, no communication came from the station. When finally a team was dispatched, they found the place abandoned. Barracks empty, power generators still humming, food trays half-eaten in the mess hall, snowdrifts pressing against doors left ajar. The antennas stood rigid against the polar sky, but the control rooms were vacant. Not a single man remained. 62 personnel, including officers, engineers, and conscripts, were simply gone. No footprints led away, no bodies were found. The official explanation released to the Ministry of Defense claimed catastrophic fire and loss of all hands, but no burn marks were visible on the structures, no ash, no wreckage, just silence. A silence deeper than before, as if the frozen earth itself had swallowed the garrison. Years later, salvagers who attempted to recover copper and steel from the ruins reported headaches, hallucinations, and sudden nosebleeds. One claimed he heard voices crackling faintly in his ear, though his radio lay switched off, batteries removed. After that, the site was declared closed military territory, patrolled by units who did not answer questions. Even now, satellite images reveal nothing but a faint outline where the airstrip once lay, blurred as though deliberately scrubbed. In Moscow archives, files on Object 712 remain heavily redacted, whole sections replaced with thick black bars. What is left, scattered through whispers and fragments, suggests a different story. Not a fire, not NATO sabotage, but something that began as a frozen signal, something that never should have been listened to in the first place. The second set of documents, stamped Top Secret, 1964, are far less orderly. Typed pages alternate with handwritten notes, margin comments in hurried Cyrillic, and sections entirely blacked out. It is here that the story of P-17 begins to fracture. One memo describes post-incident recovery operations. Another refers to unaccounted for equipment. But what catches the eye is a series of interview transcripts, statements from supply pilots, engineers, and even a few locals. None were ever meant to survive outside the vaults of the KGB. A pilot named Lieutenant Sokolov described approaching the station just weeks before it went dark. He insisted that his altimeter dropped suddenly, though his plane did not. The instruments jittered, and a shrill oscillation filled his headset. He claimed it was not a tone, but a pattern, like words forming in static. When he landed, he told a technician. The next day, his report was gone. Sokolov was transferred to another unit in the Urals. Years later, he told acquaintances that he still heard the tone in dreams, always fading into silence as he awoke. Engineers stationed at P-17 had their own confessions. One notebook, never officially filed, contains sketches of waveforms. The writer, whose name was erased, scribbled, "It is not radio, it is not noise, it is an echo." He underlined the word 3 times. Next to it, he drew a diagram resembling concentric circles bleeding outward, like ripples on black water. The final line reads, "The signal listens back." The page ends there. The locals who lived closest to the perimeter remembered stranger things. Nenets herders spoke of men in heavy coats, walking into the tundra at night, without lanterns, without dogs. They never returned. Hunters who passed within sight of the antenna field said they felt pressure in their skulls, as though the sky itself leaned down upon them. Some told of disembodied voices, familiar ones, calling them by name from the blizzard. Soviet patrols dismissed these accounts as superstition, but the KGB transcripts preserve them with unnerving detail, every phrase typed cleanly, as though the clerks themselves did not dare omit them. Officially, the investigation closed quickly. The files conclude with a simple directive: station decommissioned, area to be sterilized, dissemination of rumors punishable under Article 58. Yet the appendices betray a different narrative. There are photographs, grainy black and white shots of the barracks, the empty airstrip, the untouched mess hall. In one image, the camera caught a frozen tea glass on a table, still half full, rim frosted in ice. Another photo shows the antenna yard, but the central array appears blurred, as though vibrating during the exposure. The accompanying note: equipment interference at shutter speed 1/100. Operator denies camera malfunction. The operator's name is missing. Rumors spread quickly, despite the threat of punishment. In nearby villages, people began calling the place the Ear of the North. They said it swallowed voices, that sometimes, if the wind carried right, you could hear distant conversations through the snow, conversations that were not your own. Stories of vanishing patrols added to the legend. One detachment, sent to secure remaining equipment, never reported back. Moscow issued a statement, "Lost in a storm," but no bodies were ever recovered. Locals still whisper that their dogs would not hunt in that direction, as if they smelled something not meant for human breath. In the later Cold War years, small teams of scientists allegedly returned under cover of geological surveys. Their reports never saw daylight. What did surface, decades later, were fragments of correspondence between military engineers describing attempts at reactivation. They failed. The arrays stood motionless, rusting in the Arctic winds, but some swore that at night, faint pulses still shivered through abandoned wiring. Instruments left behind were said to tick on their own, even when stripped of batteries. The frozen signal had not died, only buried itself deeper, beyond reach of ordinary transmissions. And in Moscow, among the men who handled these files, a question remained unspoken yet persistent. If the station was listening, who or what was answering? By the mid-1970s, the files regarding Object 712 had been sealed so deeply within the KGB archive that even seasoned officers claimed ignorance of its existence. Yet a few fragments escaped, passed hand to hand through unofficial channels, photocopied in dim basements, whispered about over vodka in smoky Moscow kitchens. One such fragment is a memorandum labeled Concerning Phenomena Observed at Former Facility P-17. The language is clinical, but the details bleed horror. It reports oral manifestations in the vicinity of decommissioned structures and notes psychological instability among inspection crews. The memo concludes with the chilling phrase, "Recommend discontinuation of recovery attempts. Subject may be auto-reinforcing." In the Arctic, rumors among military personnel grew bolder. Veterans of supply convoys told younger soldiers that the station had not gone silent because of equipment failure, but because it had succeeded. What it intercepted was never NATO, never human. Some swore that the arrays had tuned into a frequency buried beneath normal communication, a residue of something older than language itself. Engineers called back to Moscow from polar expeditions returned with hollow eyes, unable to describe what they had measured. Their reports vanished. The men themselves were reassigned to low-level clerical posts, far from radios or laboratories, as if their knowledge had to be diluted into irrelevance. Local fishermen along the Kara Sea claimed to witness strange auroras at night, vertical columns of green and red light that twisted unnaturally, out of rhythm with the northern sky. They said the lights emanated not from the heavens, but from the frozen ground itself, as though the earth were leaking signal into the air. Old Nenet's stories began to merge with the new reality. The tundra was said to hum in winter, low vibrations that rattled through bones. A herder once told investigators that his grandfather warned, "Do not listen to the snow, it remembers too much." The investigators recorded his words, then filed the transcript under folklore, non-credible. One report buried in the archive concerns a scientific survey conducted in 1976. A team of 5 geophysicists was sent to collect soil samples near the abandoned site. Only 2 returned. Their official statement, typed and signed under duress, mentions a sudden blizzard, the loss of visibility, and tragic separation. But a handwritten note attached to the folder contradicts this. It reads, "Survivors describe a constant tone during storm, resembling human speech but not in Russian. Claimed companions walked willingly into whiteout, responding to unseen interlocutors." The note ends abruptly, without signature. Western intelligence caught whispers too. A declassified CIA cable from 1978 notes, "Persistent rumors of a Soviet station inoperative due to anomalous broadcast reception." The Americans dismissed it as deliberate disinformation, designed to cloud the truth of missile detection arrays. Yet even in Washington, analysts underlined a phrase in the Soviet reports, "The signal is not external." Some wondered what that could mean. None pursued it officially. Too dangerous to risk chasing ghosts in the snow. Meanwhile, scavengers who dared to trespass into restricted zones spoke of machines still humming faintly in the cold. One claimed that when he touched the rusting metal of an antenna tower, he felt warmth beneath the ice, as though a current flowed unseen. He left immediately, but not before hearing, he swore, a single word whispered in his ear. He never revealed what the word was, only that it was spoken in his deceased father's voice. Years later, his account appeared in a samizdat pamphlet circulated among dissidents, filed under Anomalous Arctic. The pamphlet was confiscated. Its author was arrested. The enduring mystery was not just the disappearance of 62 souls, but the persistence of something intangible left behind. Soviet engineers tried to dismantle what they could, shipping sensitive components south. But some equipment refused to die. Dials spun without connection to power. Oscilloscopes traced unreadable patterns in pitch-black rooms. A rumor held that Moscow stored certain pieces in underground vaults beneath Sverdlovsk, though no official record has surfaced. Those who handled them were said to fall ill with migraines, hallucinations, and, in one case, a fatal seizure. By the end of the decade, the Soviet Union's Arctic Command treated the area as taboo. Maps erased it, pilots avoided it, and official histories wrote over its existence with generic descriptions of meteorological observation posts. But among those who remembered, the name lingered, the frozen signal, a phrase that suggested not failure, but suspension, as if what had once spoken through the antennas was not gone, only waiting, trapped beneath ice, biding time until someone, somewhere, dared to listen again. A sealed dossier from 1981, marked with the crimson stamp Osoby Vazhnosti, of special importance, lies buried in the Central Archive. Its cover is water-stained, the ink of signatures faded, but the pages within retain their clarity and their weight. They do not read like ordinary reports. Instead, they resemble a record of arguments between departments, a bureaucratic struggle to decide what to do with a place that should not exist. One section, filed by the Ministry of Defense, insists the abandoned station must be demolished. Their rationale: hazardous materials, outdated infrastructure, risk of NATO reconnaissance, yet the KGB's own counter-report dismisses demolition. It warns that the station's primary apparatus is not of conventional design, and that dismantling it could result in unforeseeable consequences. The language is evasive, but a margin note written in a sharp hand adds detail. Field readings persist. Vibrations align with no known radio band. Recommend continued containment, not destruction. That phrase, continued containment, recurs throughout. It is as if Object 712 was not merely a failed listening post, but a prisoner in its own right, and tearing it down would risk setting it loose. Testimonies from those few who revisited the site in the 1980s intensify the enigma. A Soviet geologist, later identified as Sergei M., left a private diary later seized by authorities. He describes approaching the silent towers with his team. Snow piled high against rusting steel, the barracks creaked in the wind, and then, without warning, all of them heard the same low drone, a sound not carried by air, but vibrating inside their skulls. It was like standing in the middle of a bell as it rang, he wrote. No source, no direction, just the certainty that something vast was speaking through us, not to us. That night, one of his colleagues walked out into the snow. They found his coat the next morning, neatly folded on a drift. His body was never recovered. The diary ends mid-sentence. If it is not a signal, then it is, and then nothing. Fragments from KGB training manuals reference zones of acoustic hazard. Young officers were told to avoid discussing them, but field exercises sometimes placed units near restricted Arctic perimeters. Soldiers stationed at distant radar posts admitted years later that they could sometimes hear phantom transmissions at night, voices of wives, mothers, commanders, always urging them to walk outside. In most cases, the soldiers resisted, but the manuals contain lists of unexplained absences, the euphemism for those who did not return. Villagers in settlements along the Ob River began reporting strange dreams in the early 1980s. They described frozen landscapes where black pylons jutted out of the snow, endless and humming. Children cried out at night, saying the snow itself was whispering. A folklorist from Novosibirsk recorded these accounts during a field trip. When he attempted to publish his notes, his manuscript was seized, yet copies survived, hidden in private drawers. In one interview, an old Nenets woman recalled her father's warning, "Do not answer the voices of the ice. They are not our ancestors. They only wear their masks." Within Moscow, paranoia grew. Was NATO somehow broadcasting psychological warfare? Was the station receiving not from above, but from below? In one heavily redacted transcript of a Politburo meeting, a phrase emerges through the censorship bars, "Not extraterrestrial, not terrestrial." The speaker's identity is lost, but the words remain like an exposed nerve. By 1983, a classified operation known as Project Seaver 2 attempted to reactivate portions of the facility. Engineers installed new generators, rewired the towers, and connected portable monitoring equipment. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the third night, the instruments spiked violently. Recordings captured a sequence of tones, irregular but deliberate, almost like syllables. An operator present during the test later reported that the tones began to resemble his own name. Then the equipment failed, burned circuits, melted coils, irreparable. The next morning, the team requested immediate evacuation. Their written report concluded, "The broadcast is not passive, it adapts. Terminate further trials." None of them returned to the Arctic. According to subsequent files, several members of the team were hospitalized within months for neurological disturbances, migraines, auditory hallucinations, insomnia. One, in his final days, carved concentric circles into the wall of his hospital room until his hands bled. Guards noted that he muttered a single phrase over and over, "The signal listens back." After this failure, Moscow abandoned all attempts at reactivation. The towers were left to rust, their bases swallowed by snowdrifts, the outpost declared permanently closed. Yet reconnaissance aircraft continued to fly overhead, tasked with recording atmospheric anomalies. Reports show that magnetic compasses would twitch inexplicably near the site, needles spinning and freezing as if caught by unseen force. Radio operators flying in the vicinity sometimes picked up bursts of static that cut through ordinary channels. Several insisted the static concealed words, Russian, English, sometimes voices they swore they recognized. One pilot filed a report claiming he heard his dead brother's laughter. His superiors disciplined him for fatigue. Meanwhile, whispers reached the west. Scandinavian fishermen trawling near Soviet waters told stories of eerie lights flickering over the horizon. A Norwegian intelligence officer recorded testimony from a trawler captain who said he picked up Soviet chatter warning of haunted frequencies. NATO analysts dismissed it as Cold War paranoia. Yet a few linguists who reviewed intercepted Soviet signals claimed to detect hidden modulations, patterns not explainable by jamming or interference. They were ignored, and so the story of the frozen signal sank into obscurity, buried beneath layers of denial and redaction. The Soviet Union's collapse was still years away, but already the machinery of secrecy was cracking. Still, the name survived in hushed tones. Object 712, the ear of the North, the place where voices in the snow never ceased. But one question gnawed at the edges of every file, every testimony, every rumor. If the arrays were not listening to NATO and not listening to the stars, then what lay beneath the ice, speaking in human voices it should not have known? The collapse of the Soviet Union brought with it the loosening of many chains, but not all. Some secrets were carried into the 1990s like corpses dragged beneath the ice. Object 712 was one of them. In official declassified lists, the station never appeared. No mention of P-17, no acknowledgement of its existence. Yet the collapse also brought hunger, poverty, and desperate opportunism. Scavengers, smugglers, and would-be treasure hunters began to penetrate areas once forbidden. Among these intruders were men who stumbled upon the skeleton of the listening post half buried by decades of Arctic snow. Their accounts, preserved in obscure newspapers and later confiscated by shadowy inspectors, describe a place frozen in time, rusted steel towers tilted against the sky, their tips glinting with strange frost that did not melt even when torches were applied. Inside the barracks, rotting bunks still lined the walls, personal belongings scattered, boots, torn letters, a pocket watch frozen at midnight. Yet the strangest detail repeated by multiple intruders was sound. They claimed the silence was never complete. A faint hum pervaded the air, like a living current. One described it as the feeling of bees inside your skull, though there were no bees, no insects, no wind. In 1993, a former KGB archivist attempted to publish a memoir in which he included references to Object 712. He never used the code directly, but he wrote of a polar city erased from maps, where voices of the dead were harvested. The manuscript was seized before publication, and the archivist was found dead in his apartment weeks later. Official cause: heart failure. Yet acquaintances reported strange scorch marks on the wiring of his tape recorder, as though it had burned from the inside. He had been recording his own voice for dictation. The final tape, never released publicly, contained 20 minutes of silence, broken at the very end by a faint, rhythmic tapping. Throughout the 1990s, oil prospectors and geological surveyors occasionally crossed the forbidden perimeter. Their stories converged, compasses spinning wildly, radios alive with phantom broadcasts, snowstorms that appeared out of nowhere. One surveyor wrote in his logbook, "Signal consistent at 17 hertz, impossible for natural origin. Feels less like listening, more like being listened to." The log was later confiscated during a routine inspection. The surveyor disappeared on his next expedition. His body was never recovered, only his orange marker flag found driven into the snow like a gravestone. At the same time, rumors spread among locals that post-Soviet authorities had not truly abandoned the site. Villagers reported unmarked helicopters landing at night, men in black uniforms carrying sealed crates. Some said new equipment was installed inside the gutted control room, not to reactivate the old towers, but to bury them under layers of shielding. One fisherman swore he saw men welding plates of lead over the main generator hall. He told this to a journalist in Arkhangelsk. The journalist vanished a month later on a trip north. His last article draft ended mid-sentence. "The sound is not gone, it is simply waiting beneath the ice." Fragments of leaked documents, likely sold by desperate former officers, reached Western researchers in the late 1990s. One such fragment, published anonymously on a Finnish radio enthusiasts forum, contained schematics of unusual antenna designs. Unlike traditional radar or communications arrays, these devices were circular, layered, almost organic in shape. The note beneath them read, "Phase coils, resonant structures, not for sending, not for receiving, for harmonizing." No further explanation was given. The post was deleted within hours, the user account erased, but copies circulated, fueling speculation that Object 712 was never about NATO at all, but about something hidden in the very fabric of the polar environment. Survivors from nearby garrisons began speaking cautiously, decades after their service. One described a night watch when a thin line of light stretched across the horizon, sharper than any aurora. It pulsed 3 times, and for a moment the entire outpost's power grid flickered and died. When lights returned, he swore he heard, faintly, his mother calling his name through the static of the shortwave. His mother had been dead for 10 years. He never reported the incident officially. Instead, he wrote it down and sealed it in an envelope labeled, "To be opened after my death." That letter, opened by his grandson in 2001, found its way onto the internet before quickly disappearing. By the dawn of the new millennium, a myth had solidified. The frozen signal was not merely an accident of Soviet hubris, but a curse left humming in the Arctic wastes. Locals refused to hunt near the zone. Dogs howled and pulled their masters away from the perimeter. Some said Entire reindeer herds collapsed in convulsions when driven too close. Others claimed the snow itself sometimes bore the imprint of human footprints, perfectly preserved, leading nowhere, fading into nothing. The silence imposed by the Soviet state had fractured, but it had not vanished. Instead, the enigma of Object 712 had seeped outward, into whispers, into folklore, into scattered fragments of testimony. It lingered like radiation, unseen, unmeasured, but undeniable. For those who knew even a fraction of the truth, one fact became clear. The signal had never stopped. It was not extinguished in 1963. It had only slipped deeper, embedding itself beneath layers of denial, waiting for new ears, new instruments, new believers. And if the station had once listened outward, then perhaps now it was listening inward, carried in the minds of those who dared to remember. By the early 2000s, the mystery of Object 712 had transformed into something more than rumor. It became a gravitational point for fringe researchers, conspiracy theorists, and even serious academics who could not resist the allure of an enigma buried in the Arctic. The new Russian Federation, chaotic and fractured, had neither the discipline nor the resources to guard every secret. Some barriers were lifted, others simply collapsed. But the zone around the abandoned listening post remained curiously well protected. Helicopters still circled, access roads were patrolled by unmarked men. Official maps marked the region as ecologically hazardous, no entry. The explanation was thin, yet no one dared to challenge it openly. Still, fragments escaped. One of the strangest surfaced in 2004 when an amateur radio operator in Murmansk claimed to have intercepted a transmission unlike any he had heard before. It was a steady, low-frequency hum, punctuated by faint syllables. He recorded 5 minutes of it before his receiver burst into static. He later posted the file online. Within 24 hours, his account was deleted, and the file scrubbed from every mirror site. But those few who downloaded it in time described something unsettling. The syllables seemed to shift depending on who listened. Some swore they heard Russian words, names, commands. Others claimed the syllables resembled English phrases. A linguist from Helsinki said he recognized fragments of Sami ritual chants. Each listener heard what they most feared or longed for. Parallel to these odd leaks, internal Russian military reports began to circulate, obtained by investigative journalists who worked too close to the fire. One report, stamped 2006, Severny Voyenny Okrug, described a reconnaissance team sent to inspect the ruins after reports of trespassers. The team of 8 men established camp 2 kilometers from the site. On their third night, 3 disappeared. The remaining 5 described hearing persistent voices through their radios, though the sets had been switched off to conserve batteries. The voices allegedly repeated personal details, birth dates, names of children, old military call signs. When the surviving men were extracted, 2 were diagnosed with acute psychosis. The report ends with a chilling directive. Refrain from further deployment. Seal perimeter. Object remains active. By 2008, Arctic oil exploration revived attention to the region. Foreign corporations eyed the territory greedily, proposing joint projects with Moscow. Yet negotiations always collapsed when survey routes neared the restricted coordinates. Norwegian officials privately complained that Russian delegates grew visibly nervous when maps approached certain latitudes. One leaked cable from the U.S. Embassy in Oslo noted, "Unclear whether Russians conceal environmental contamination or classified installation. Their avoidance borders on superstition." Meanwhile, within Russia itself, folklore adapted to modern times. Young conscripts stationed in the north posted anonymously on early forums about the ghost station. They claimed it was cursed, that soldiers dared each other to approach within sight of the antenna skeletons. One post, quickly deleted, described a ritual. If you tune a field radio to static near the zone, you will eventually hear your own voice answering back, slightly delayed, as though bouncing from somewhere far older than the ionosphere. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker attempted to reach the site under the guise of shooting a film about Arctic ecology. His small crew disappeared for 3 days. When they returned to the nearest settlement, they were disheveled, their equipment destroyed. The filmmaker refused to speak of what happened. Later, one of the assistants broke silence. She described walking through snowdrifts and suddenly realizing there were voices all around them, but not from any direction. It was like the air itself was talking, she said. We covered our ears, but it didn't help. The sound came from inside. The footage recovered from their cameras contained nothing but static. Academic interest flared again in 2012 when a physicist from Tomsk University published a controversial paper proposing the existence of natural resonant cavities beneath Arctic permafrost, capable of amplifying electromagnetic anomalies. He never mentioned Object 712 directly, but the coordinates referenced in his models corresponded eerily to the Forbidden Zone. His paper was denounced, withdrawn, and replaced with an official retraction. Months later, the physicist was killed in a car accident. His surviving colleagues quietly admitted he had been studying confiscated Soviet equipment, coils and oscillators traced back to the abandoned listening post. The persistence of these stories suggested one undeniable truth. Whatever had silenced the original garrison in 1963 had not vanished. It had adapted, outlasted, and infiltrated new generations of listeners. The phrase that haunted Cold War engineers, "the signal listens back," now gained new resonance. Internet forums dedicated to number stations and shortwave mysteries began to circulate supposed frozen files, audio clips allegedly recorded near the Arctic Circle. Some were obvious hoaxes, layered whispers and digital static. Others resisted explanation. In one infamous clip, uploaded in 2015, a faint Russian lullaby can be heard beneath heavy distortion. Analysts who filtered the track insisted the voice was a woman's, aged, trembling. A user later claimed the lullaby was identical to one his grandmother had sung, though she had died decades earlier in a camp near Vorkuta. By the late 2010s, the silence around Object 712 seemed less like deliberate suppression and more like a protective shroud, an acknowledgement that the enigma itself was too dangerous to probe. Yet the traces remain. Blurred satellite images, classified Russian operations, anonymous testimonies leaking into digital spaces. The official narrative insists there is nothing but frozen wasteland, ruins of a meteorological station. But those who know the whispers understand. The signal never ceased. It only waits, suspended beneath layers of frost, listening as it always has, hungry for ears that dare to acknowledge it. And in the quiet corridors of forgotten archives, boxes of yellowing papers still rest, filled with fragments, typed directives, half-erased names, photos blurred by vibration. Each one is a reminder that the Soviet Union may have fallen, but its ghosts endure, humming eternally in the Arctic night. In 2017, a team of adventure tourists from St. Petersburg claimed to have skirted the edges of the Forbidden Zone. They traveled by snowmobile, seeking the thrill of touching places Soviet maps had erased. Their photographs, briefly shared on social media before deletion, show broken pylons rising from the tundra, half swallowed by drifts, coded in rhyme. One picture, however, drew attention for reasons the group never explained. Behind a rusted tower, faint streaks of light cut the air, vertical, pale, like frozen lightning suspended in a photograph. Commenters speculated it was lens flare, until one of the tourists posted a caption, "We didn't see the light with our eyes, only the camera did." Hours later, their account vanished. That same year, a leaked medical report from Arkhangelsk surfaced briefly on underground forums. It described 4 men admitted with identical symptoms: severe migraines, auditory hallucinations, and sudden hemorrhaging from the ears. All 4 had been contracted by a private resource company to perform surveying work near the restricted zone. Their testimonies, hastily transcribed before their transfer to a Moscow hospital, describe a chilling detail. Each man reported hearing a loved one's voice, different for each, calling them by name from beneath the ice. One man claimed he saw footprints ahead of him in the snow, leading toward the antenna ruins, but when he followed, the tracks multiplied until they surrounded him from every direction. Official explanations remained predictable. State spokesmen dismissed the zone as a contaminated area, citing hazardous waste from outdated Soviet experiments. Yet such words convinced no one. Environmentalists who attempted to investigate found nothing, because every time they approached, they were turned back by silent men in unmarked vehicles. No insignia, no explanations. Just the gesture to leave. The frozen signal entered modern folklore as something more than a Soviet relic. On Russian message boards, stories began circulating about mobile phones behaving strangely near the northern territories, screens flickering, batteries draining, microphones activating without input. Some users claimed to hear faint breathing through their speakers at night, even when calls were not active. Skeptics dismissed it as paranoia, yet those who compared recordings noted something uncanny. The rhythm of the breathing matched across separate devices, as though carried on a shared current. Among military veterans, the legend persisted with greater weight. A retired officer, interviewed anonymously for an online podcast in 2019, spoke of a classified exercise in which drones were flown over the zone to test mapping capabilities. According to him, 3 drones never returned. Their feeds froze at the same moment, capturing a single frame, a horizon of snow, marred by shadowy shapes resembling figures standing motionless in the distance. When technicians tried to recover the footage, the files corrupted, looping endlessly with a single line of distorted audio, a voice repeating, "Slyšiš меня? Do you hear me?" Even Western observers began to take quiet interest. A Canadian Arctic researcher wrote of interference anomalies detected near Russian airspace, bursts of energy at frequencies below the human hearing range. He proposed tectonic explanations, but admitted privately in letters that the patterns were too regular. "It's like listening to the heartbeat of something vast, buried under miles of ice," he confessed. Shortly after, his research grant was revoked. By the end of the decade, the legend of Object 712 was no longer confined to dusty archives or Cold War veterans. It had seeped into the collective imagination, resurfacing whenever silence fell heavy in the Arctic night. A place where voices lived in static, where towers still hummed in the wind, where men vanished as if answering a call no one else could hear. And always, in the margins of every testimony, in the last line of every confiscated report, the same unspoken fear lingered that the Soviet Union had not simply abandoned a failed project. It had locked away a door it accidentally opened, hoping no one, in their hunger or their curiosity, would dare to knock again. By 2020, the legend of the frozen signal had crossed borders and languages, whispered not only in Russia, but in forums, academic corridors, and late-night radio broadcasts abroad. It no longer belonged to the Soviet past. It had become a living story that refused to stay buried. Yet behind the fog of speculation, fragments of something darker continued to surface. Pieces of testimony, blurred photographs, corrupted audio files. Each added a new layer of dread, suggesting that what began in the 1960s had never stopped resonating. One of the most disturbing accounts emerged from a joint scientific expedition, organized quietly between Russian and Norwegian researchers under the guise of climate monitoring. Officially, they were measuring methane releases from thawing permafrost. Unofficially, at least according to one participant's later confession, their true purpose was to place seismic recorders near the coordinates once belonging to Object 712. Their equipment registered strange pulses deep underground, evenly spaced, deliberate, almost mechanical. It wasn't tectonics, the scientist insisted. It was patterned, like a transmission buried beneath the ice. The data vanished from official records, and the scientist was later discredited for fabrication. But his private notebooks, smuggled to Helsinki, told another story. The ice is not silent. It repeats itself endlessly as though waiting for an answer. In the same year, rumors spread in Arkhangelsk of 3 hunters who ventured too close to the zone. They never returned, but their snowmobiles were later found abandoned. One machine still idled, engines sputtering in the cold. In the sidecar of another lay a reel-to-reel tape recorder, the tape still spinning. When investigators played it back, they heard 30 minutes of faint static punctuated by a woman's laughter. No one recognized the voice. The recording was locked away. Word leaked only because one policeman, unable to sleep, spoke of it drunkenly in a bar. He described the laughter as not happy, not human, like someone remembering you when they shouldn't. The internet amplified these fragments into obsession. Amateur explorers planned expeditions, promising to live stream their approach to the ghost station. None succeeded. Equipment failed, drones lost signal, GPS maps scrambled. One group uploaded a final clip, a white expanse, wind howling, and in the distance, a skeletal tower swaying, though no storm touched it. Then the feed cut out. Their followers never heard from them again. Authorities dismissed it as a hoax, yet no trace of the group was found in civil registries afterward. It was as if their identities themselves had been erased. Meanwhile, scattered archives continued to bleed secrets. In 2021, a cache of microfilms surfaced on the black market in Riga. Among them was a memo dated 1961, written before the station went silent. It warned of phase shifts in personnel behavior, noting that several conscripts reported dreams of walking into the snow, guided by voices too familiar to resist. The memo's final line chilled collectors who read it. Recommend limiting station staff rotation. The signal appears contagious through memory alone. If true, the enigma was not only a sound, but an infection, an idea transmitted like a virus. Locals in Siberian villages still told simpler stories, stripped of science and bureaucracy. They said that in deep winter, when the sky bled green with auroras, you could sometimes hear music in the snowdrifts. Accordions, balalaikas, laughter of long-dead soldiers. Some warned that if you stopped to listen, you would never leave the tundra. Others claimed their grandparents spoke of an empty city of metal bones, where prisoners were taken, never to return. Folklore blurred with memory, and memory blurred with what the state had erased. Western agencies, too, seemed unable to look away. A leaked NATO report from 2022 mentions unexplained electromagnetic anomalies detected during routine Arctic patrols. Though couched in technical jargon, one line stands out. Pattern recurrence suggests artificial source, not natural interference. The report speculates briefly on the possibility of residual Soviet technology before abruptly ending with an addendum, no further analysis recommended. The deliberate vagueness was more telling than any admission. At the edges of these narratives lies something even more unsettling. The suggestion that the signal itself adapts. Pilots in the Russian north claim their radios sometimes catch faint transmissions, identical in structure to Cold War-era number stations, but with one difference. Instead of random digits, the voices recite names, lists of names, some recognizable as missing soldiers, others unknown entirely. The implication is clear, though no one dares say it aloud. The station is still listening, still cataloging, still waiting. For ordinary Russians, the frozen signal became a story told like a warning. Parents hushed children with tales of the ear of the North, the place that stole voices. For others, it was an obsession, a mystery that gnawed at the edge of history. Was it a failed Soviet experiment, a relic of paranoia? Or was it something older, something that Soviet engineers stumbled upon and tried, fatally, to harness? And yet, every testimony, every fragment, circles back to one undeniable truth. The silence is not empty. It is filled with something vast, something patient, and something that remembers. Always the same question echoes, whether from lost hunters, corrupted recordings, or dreams carried on Arctic winds. Do you hear me? Even now, no one can answer without fear that the very act of listening is enough to be heard in return. The winter of 2023 brought with it another layer of unease. Satellite analysts in Europe noticed a strange anomaly while reviewing imagery over the Kara Sea. A faint distortion in thermal readings around the coordinates long associated with Object 712. It was not heat in the conventional sense, but a pulse, regular, rhythmic, as if the frozen ground itself exhaled. Publicly, the anomaly was attributed to methane release from melting permafrost. Privately, technicians whispered that the pattern resembled a signal rather than a geological process. The pulse was too precise, too steady. Soon after, fishermen near Dixon reported an aurora unlike any they had seen before. It appeared as a vertical curtain of light, not sweeping across the sky, but standing still, like a frozen wall. For nearly 20 minutes, radios across the settlement buzzed with interference. Local operators swore they heard fragments of speech buried in the static. Commands, lullabies, whispered prayers. One man insisted he heard his own name, repeated 3 times in his dead brother's voice. The aurora faded, and silence returned. But no one in the village spoke of it openly, as if naming it aloud would bring it back. That same year, a hiker from Moscow vanished on a solo trek toward the restricted zone. His body was never found, but his camera was recovered by search parties weeks later. Most photographs showed ordinary tundra. The final frame, however, captured the silhouette of a man standing far off, half shrouded by snow. His face was indistinct, blurred beyond recognition, but the outline of his uniform resembled the Soviet issue of the 1960s. Experts dismissed it as a trick of light. Yet some who saw the photo in private swore they felt watched while looking at it, as if the figure's eyes remained fixed on them even through the grain of the film. Whispers reached Moscow, too. Internal security briefings noted an increase in trespassing attempts by amateur explorers and foreign adventurers. The reports do not dwell on what happened to these intruders. They merely list them as neutralized incidents. Yet in one file, half erased by censors, a sentence survives. Subject reported hearing wife's voice calling from inside the array ruins. Subject walked forward, ignoring commands to stop. No trace recovered. Meanwhile, strange recordings appeared online, attributed to shortwave enthusiasts. One in particular spread quickly before deletion. 30 seconds of static broken by a voice repeating, "Ya slishu tebya," I hear you. Listeners reported something unnerving. The voice did not sound like a machine or a broadcast. It sounded personal, intimate, as though directed at each individual listener alone. Some claimed it even matched the timbre of their own voices. Others refused to speak of what they heard at all. The Russian government continued to deny the site's existence, insisting it was nothing but frozen wasteland. Yet in 2024, unmarked transport aircraft were spotted flying repeated routes into the high Arctic, landing on improvised airstrips near the old coordinates. Locals said the flights came only at night, under cover of blizzards. What they carried, no one knew. But after each visit, dogs in nearby villages howled for days without pause, refusing food, staring at the horizon as if awaiting something unseen. By now, the line between Soviet history and present danger had collapsed entirely. Object 712 was no longer just a Cold War myth. It was alive, still shaping the land and the people around it. Academics who once dismissed the legend began to reconsider. Was it possible that the Soviets had stumbled onto a natural resonance, an environmental phenomenon amplified by their technology? Or was it something worse, an intelligence buried in ice, awakened by the first antenna that dared to listen? The fragments suggest no clear answer. Only this: the silence of the Arctic is not empty. It is crowded, layered, and patient. Every attempt to record, to investigate, to dismantle has ended the same way, with missing men, corrupted files, and whispers that should not exist. And always, at the center, the same question that has lingered since 1963, when 62 men vanished into nothing. Did they listen too long? Or did something finally begin to listen back? Even now, the frozen signal waits. Some say you can hear it if you stand in the snow on a windless night, when the world falls utterly still. A faint vibration, a low hum, shaping itself slowly into words you almost recognize. Not in your ears, but in your bones. Not outside, but inside. And once you hear it, you will never truly be alone again. The last fragments lie buried in a folder stamped DSP, for official use only, never meant for public eyes. Inside are reports from the late 2020s, their language clinical, but laced with unease. They speak of increased electromagnetic instability in the northern sectors, of satellites failing to maintain steady orbits when passing over the coordinates of the abandoned station. One page describes unexplained audio bleed, captured on secure government channels, faint voices breaking into encrypted communications, repeating classified phrases that should have been impossible to intercept. The conclusion is chilling in its understatement. Containment no longer guaranteed. Rumors seep through the cracks. Locals whisper of military convoys heading north in silence, headlights blacked out, tires wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. Some say the soldiers never return. Others claim they come back changed, quiet, withdrawn, staring at the horizon as if listening to something only they can hear. Fishermen in the Kara Sea avoid entire stretches of water, claiming their nets come up tangled with wires, cables, and rusted steel that seem to pulse faintly when touched. The elders warn their grandchildren never to follow strange voices on the wind, even if those voices belong to family. Especially if they belong to family. Online, the story has taken on new life. Anonymous accounts post coordinates, audio files, blurred images of skeletal towers standing against pale skies. Each upload vanishes within hours. The platform scrubbed, the accounts erased, yet the fragments persist, copied, reshared, like the signal itself, unkillable, always returning, and the recordings, they grow stranger. One clip, lasting only 10 seconds, has circulated among collectors, a chorus of voices whispering in unison. When filtered through software, the words emerge in multiple languages, Russian, English, German, even Latin. Yet all say the same phrase, "We are still here." Some researchers argue that the Soviets uncovered a natural phenomenon, resonant cavities in the ice amplifying electromagnetic fields until they mimicked speech. Others suggest a more terrifying possibility, that the signal was never natural, but intentional, a transmission that had been echoing for centuries, waiting for ears to catch it. Perhaps the arrays of Object 7912 were not the first to hear it. Perhaps they were only the latest. And still, questions remain unanswered. What became of the 62 men who vanished in 1963? Why do their names surface in modern recordings? Why do strangers across the globe swear they hear the voices of their dead in the static? Was Object 712 destroyed or buried alive beneath the snow, its rusting towers nothing more than bait for something deeper? In the end, the documents do not resolve the mystery. They end abruptly, with silence, pages torn, signatures missing, entire sections blacked out, as if the archive itself was afraid to finish the story. The final line typed on the last surviving sheet reads, "Monitoring to continue. Contact imminent." Perhaps the Soviet Union never erased a city from the maps. Perhaps the erasure was only a mask, a way to hide what could not be explained. Or perhaps it was something darker, an attempt to bury a mistake that was never theirs to make. The tundra keeps its secrets well. Snow falls, ice thickens, winds erase footprints. Yet the silence of the Arctic is deceptive. Somewhere beneath it, the frozen signal hums, patient, eternal, listening still. And if you stop to listen long enough, if you let the static seep into your bones, you may hear it too. The question is not whether the Soviets erased the truth. The question is whether they succeeded. Because once you hear the voices in the snow, you cannot unhear them. And the only certainty is this: the signal does not sleep, it waits, and it never stops listening.